This is an area of very low rainfall. Trees adapted to this environment are stunted, and few grow more than 4 meters high. The vegetation must be able to survive without much water for long periods in this arid part of southern Australia called the mallee. The mallee trees appear to be dead, but they're not. They're a form of eucalyptus, evergreen trees which shed their bark once a year. Among the trees are peculiar mounds. Early explorers assumed they were Aboriginal burial places and dismissed the native suggestion that they were in fact birds' nests. The Aborigines were telling the truth. The mounds are the nests of a fascinating bird called the mallee fowl. It took 200 years before the secret of how they work was revealed. The mallee fowl's nest is a storage heater, a method of conserving heat to incubate its eggs. It's a unique process which has evolved to allow them to survive in this harsh environment. The mallee area extends across most of the southern half of Australia. In its southeast corner in the state of Victoria, the temperature can vary from 40 degrees to freezing within one 24-hour period. At Nil, a typical community in mallee country, the climate is similar to that of the Sahara Desert. The people are mostly farmers growing wheat. Because the yield per hectare is low, the fields are large. Competition with humans is another pressure on the mallee fowl. The mallee fowl is a special bird here. Nil is the principal town of Lowan County, and Lowan is the Aboriginal name for mallee fowl. The town centre features a sculpture of the bird and its nest. The sculptor used imagination to portray the nest before the real facts were known, and the eggs are not actually in the right place. It's not surprising that the mallee fowl's nest has been a mystery for so long. It's so different from the nests made by most other birds. First, the mallee fowls make a hole in the ground. During the autumn, the birds scrape together vegetation from the surrounding scrub and pile it into the hole. Then they leave it. They wait for rain. Sometimes the rain doesn't come, in which case they don't breed that season. But most years there's at least a heavy shower, and that's enough to start the leaves fermenting, like a compost heap. As they ferment, the leaves give off heat. To trap the heat, the birds pile sand over the hole, building a mound which may be up to 2 meters high. Some mallee fowl mounds are more than 100 years old. Most of the birds habitually return to the same nest site. One local farmer kept trying to put up a fence, and every time he dug a hole for a post, the mallee fowl came along and enlarged it as a potential nest site. This mound is a historic monument. It's known to have been in use since before 1884. The birds scrape sand from all round the hole until they built a circular wall round the compost heap. They work continuously under the blazing sun, shifting over a ton of sand in one day, kicking it backwards with their powerful legs. The male is responsible for most of the mound construction and monitoring. He appears to decide when the wall is the right size. Then the center has to be piled up so that the peak is exactly over the fermenting leaves in the hole below. He'll ensure this by going to the middle of the ring and working outwards from the center, kicking the sand behind him. The female joins him, and together they work to fill up the center. Occasionally, one or other bird leaves to take a rest in the shade. The other carries on working, hurling back footfuls of sand until the profile of the mound is smooth and rounded and the work is almost complete. As they work, the birds call quietly to one another. This communication may serve to coordinate their efforts. By the evening, the result of their work is a compost-powered incubator, gradually warming up as fermentation takes place inside. While this is a remarkable achievement, the next stage of the process is even more impressive. The birds leave the mound alone for 3 or 4 weeks. Then, early one morning, they return and start dismantling the whole thing. They remove the whole ton of sand from the center. The male begins the work, and again the female joins in. They work to and from the middle of the pile, as they did when they were building it, to keep the center in the right place. It seems an almost impossible task, rather like moving a sand dune with a teaspoon. But the birds work slowly and persistently. One bird removes the debris and one excavates, and they make surprisingly quick progress. The male appears to be pecking up small objects from the sand, then taking beakfuls of it, but he's not feeding at all. He's checking the temperature of the mound. Scientists have discovered that the malleefowl's tongue is extremely sensitive to heat. The bird buries its beak in the mound to see whether it's reached the correct temperature to incubate the eggs. He tests it in several places, and if the temperature's right, the female lays the first egg. The temperature must be around 35 degrees centigrade if the eggs are to hatch. The date when the first egg is laid depends on the weather and the progress of fermentation. Between the end of September and late February, they may produce up to 33 eggs at weekly intervals. In a dry year, the interval may extend to nearly 3 weeks, and the total only 8 or 9 eggs. Each time an egg is laid, the mound has to be opened up right to the bottom and filled in again. If the heat from fermentation builds up too much, the birds open the mound to let the heat escape. If the sun gets too hot, they pile on more sand for added insulation. Their lives center around the nest from June to the end of April. When fermentation has stopped below the egg chamber, the birds will even spread out the sand to warm in the sun before piling it back again. The first of the mound-building birds, called megapodes, which means big feet, was discovered in the Philippines in 1521, long before Australia was discovered. A century later, the pioneer ornithologist Francis Willoughby decided not to include them in his book about the birds of the world. He couldn't believe the travellers' tales about them and dismissed the whole story. For the 8 weeks that the egg is incubating, its temperature rarely changes by as much as 1 degree, regardless of the weather outside. The behaviour of the malleefowl was discovered in the course of over 40 years' work by an Australian naturalist named Keith Hately. He visited the mounds so often to measure them and make notes that the birds became tame enough to let him watch them at close quarters. In fact, they even interfered with his observations, although they didn't allow him to interrupt their mound-building activities. Keith Hately started watching malleefowl in 1930 to satisfy his personal curiosity. In 1938, he was paid to continue his study by the Fish and Game Department of the state of Victoria. After a break during the war years, his work continued. In the course of his work, he waited until the birds had opened the mound before he moved in to examine the eggs. But by then, they were ready to fill it in again. The scientific study became a digging race to see whether Keith Hately could open the mound before the birds closed it. During his study, Keith Hately unearthed some surprising facts. A healthy mallee hen at the start of the breeding season may weigh about 2 kilos. Her eggs weigh around 170 grams each. If she lays 20 in a good season, she's produced in 5 months nearly twice her own weight in eggs. Though the eggs are large for the size of the bird, it's not quite true, as one 16th century monk believed, that the eggs of megapodes are bigger than the birds themselves. The bird settles to rest in a dust bowl it's made for itself near the mound. To test the accuracy with which the malleefowl maintains the temperature of its egg chamber, in contrast to the weather outside, Keith Hately uses a thermometer with a long tube which is buried in the egg chamber. This amount of disturbance would cause many birds to abandon their nest, but not the malleefowl. There's a case on record of a fox that raised 6 cubs right beside a malleefowl mound without interrupting the birds. Today, foxes are considered a major threat to the malleefowl's survival. As Keith closes the nest again, the bird comes back and works with him to fill up the mound and protect the eggs from the late morning sun. The malleefowl is just as timid as any other bird in normal circumstances, but it will get used to regular visitors if they approach quietly and do nothing to alarm the bird. When the eggs are covered again, Keith Hately installs a second thermometer, this one to measure the surface temperature of the mound. The interior is slightly overheated. The bird was correct to want to protect its eggs from the heat of the sun. So far, the external thermometer is still showing the temperature of the inside of the rucksack it was carried in. A few minutes later, it's registering correctly. The temperature of the sand surface on this warm summer's day has risen to over 50 degrees centigrade. The egg chamber is still quite safe at 36 degrees. An hour later, it's still constant, while the surface temperature has gone off the scale at 60 degrees centigrade. The next morning, the ground temperature has fallen to 10 degrees centigrade, but the egg chamber is still at 36 degrees, blood heat. The bird's response to this is to begin to spread the top layer of sand out to absorb the warmth as the sun gets higher. When the sand has warmed up, they'll pile it back again, so that the stored heat will keep the eggs warm through the following night. Both birds are involved, but on this particular morning, the male was digging when something different happened. A small creature appeared just where he was digging. After 8 weeks of moving sand and checking temperatures, the first egg has hatched. The chick was digging towards the surface when its parent completed the task for it. There's no bond between adult and chick. After all the care and immense physical effort they expend to keep the eggs in perfect condition, the parent birds don't even recognize their chicks when they hatch. The chicks seem to be apprehensive of their parents. They run away from them and wander off to grow up alone in the waterless bush of the Mallee country. All the parent bird's energy and attention is directed to maintaining the incubator almost all year round. They don't have time to care for the young by feeding and brooding them as other birds do. Each pair of adult birds might produce 15 chicks each season. Probably 12 of these will die within the first 6 months of life. The adults can live for 30 years, and in that time need only to produce 2 living offspring to maintain the population numbers. If anything happens to the adults, there are plenty of younger birds to take their place at the mounds. Eventually, Keith Hately came to know almost exactly to the day when an egg was due to hatch. He could listen to a mallee fowl mound and hear the chick coming to the surface. Today, the faint sound of a struggle approaching the surface indicates that another young mallee fowl chick is about to make an appearance. Keith Hately's extensive studies of the mallee fowl chicks have revealed that when they hatch, they're among the most advanced young in the world of birds. Although they weigh only 115 grams, they're fully mobile and even have a full set of flight feathers. They need to be advanced because they receive no parental care once they've hatched. Despite having come to the surface just 5 minutes ago, the young mallee fowl is extremely precocious. It instinctively has the knowledge it needs to survive. It knows how to look for food, to run from its enemies, how to hide, and how to fly. Keith Hately has seen chicks fly within a few hours of hatching. No other bird has this amazing ability. However, chicks of most other species have their parents to protect them. The malleefowl chick walks away when it thinks danger is past. Most mallee chicks emerge in the morning. They probably work their way to the top of the mound during the night and then lie just beneath the surface until the sun warms it. The mallee chick is specially adapted in another way too. In the arid mallee scrub, it's able to live without drinking water. Like other desert-dwelling species, the malleefowl can extract water from its food, even though it may consist mostly of dry seeds. It's not surprising that the malleefowl lays such large eggs. They have to be big enough to provide food for a chick which in most respects emerges as a miniature adult. The egg's capacity also allows the chick to exercise its growing muscles before it hatches. With its flight feathers almost completely developed, the chick spends its first cool night outside the nest, roosting at the top of a tree. Keith Haitley's work inspired a friend. Wimpy Reichelt had a travel company. In 1973, he bought 80 hectares of mallee scrub and frequently accompanied Haitley on his observation of the 4 nests on his land to assist with the work. A daily record of the size of the mound as it varied with the weather and seasons was one of the clues to how it works. Wimpy Reichelt's main concern was to protect the malleefowl's habitat. If the land hadn't been preserved, it would have been turned into wheat fields. The dark green of the mallee is being replaced by the pale gold of the wheat fields, and more is disappearing every year. Of the 60 mounds in Keith Haitley's study area in 1930, most have now been ploughed under, forgotten amongst the crops. Wimpy Reichelt put his area of mallee to an additional use. His travel business specialized in taking people into the desert. Now he had an extra attraction to offer. Come and see a malleefowl at work. As long as visits are regular and organized, the birds aren't frightened away. Once they become accustomed to being watched, they just get on with their normal behavior. For the people watching them, it's a fascinating sight. The amount of work the malleefowl invest in their storage heater nest is enormous. Despite the fact that Australian farmers are concerned primarily with the economics of land use, some of them are concerned that the malleefowl has become one of Australia's endangered species. So they've allowed islands of mallee scrub to remain among the wheatlands, to give these remarkable mound builders a better chance of survival.
Come with 5 to Bird Island off the coast of Africa tomorrow night for a great many gannets.